I would like to thank Rajni Shah for proactively organizing this talk. Many thanks to Tridip Saha, Meghna, and all other office bearers of the ECE GSA. I graduated from Purdue in 2011. I view this talk as a way of giving back to the school, which has given me so much. It's a deep honor to speak with you all this afternoon. Any guesses who this might be? I think the joy of signal processing may have given you a hint. This is Professor Charles Bowman. In the fall of 2009, I took ECE 301 with him. It sparked a lifelong love for Fourier transforms. He taught me about the research process, and to this day, I remain deeply grateful for the lessons I have learned from working under him. I like to show off my professors. I took ECE 538 with Professor Zoltowski. I love his enthusiasm to teach this class. Professor Mellak's teaching style has greatly impacted me. He inspired me to want to teach. I was a grader for Mimi. She showed me the value of aspiring for perfection. Professor Alabat generously permitted me to co-author course notes for ECE 438. He also allowed me to be a learning assistant for the course the semester I graduated. I had high expectations from graduate school. Little did I know that it's incorrect to benchmark against a previous high. You will likely make a disproportionate amount of money if you go into industry, my advisor had said. Given the low stipend, you want to quantify the return on investment in graduate school. Find the best slave master, one who puts you through excruciating torture so you understand the research philosophy well, he had said. I was unable to find a professor who would drive me towards perfection. Without an advisor, there was no moving forward in school. I had worked my way up diligently all these years. There's no magic formula to success, a senior colleague at Purdue had told me. You simply work hard and push yourself to the next level. Only now, there was no rung above on the ladder. I had nowhere to go. I saw firsthand how papers and presentations were reviewed, how the professor interacted with senior students, and the doctoral candidates' collective attitude towards the research process. I found no semblance of my previous experience at Purdue. I sorely missed all the things I had come to love about research: the writing process, the peer editing system, the one-on-one meetings with the advisor, and the involvement each student had in the other's work. This much was clear to me. If I stayed on in this lab, I would be in mourning until graduation. You can only be as good as your professor, my Purdue advisor had told me. He had been right all along. At its heart, the doctoral program is an apprenticeship. The advisor is responsible for tying the seemingly disparate threads of a student's mathematical ability, communication skills, and programming knowledge, and forming a cohesive narrative. You could be a genius and have all the core concepts in your field at the tip of your fingers. You will still be doomed in a graduate program if your advisor did not proactively make you a better researcher. The primary responsibility of your mentor is to teach you the art of doing substantial research. Although I had taken on a heavy load of 3 graduate courses and a teaching assignment, an unnerving lethargy was eating into my days. It must have been helplessness. Graduate school was where I wanted to be. For so many years, I dreamed of it being the place where I could finally shine and excel. To be let down now was not merely disappointing. I felt cheated, deprived of the life I wanted to mold for myself. I'm not a healthcare provider. This presentation is based on my experiences with depression. The statements I'm making are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any condition or disease. This talk is not intended as a substitute for consultation with a licensed healthcare provider. I think I now understand why people sometimes cry unexpectedly, without reason. Sometimes your brain can play games with you. It can tell you a story that you're no good. The first time you process the tale, you question it. Maybe my brain is trying to fool me, you think. Now, let's repeat the story on loop. All this while, when you're being convinced that you will likely never make it, you remain physically inactive. Tiredness sets in as you wait for your mind to settle down. The futility of this exercise, this constant war to reclaim your mental faculties, even as a predatory force stamps all over, is what causes you to cry. Tearing up came with nasty companions: a pounding headache, a swollen face, and a head cold. You often used your phone's front camera, measuring the magnitude of devastation by how unrecognizable you look even to yourself. Don't compare yourself with your classmate, a well wisher once told me. I thought she was being phony. You can read up online about the ill effects of comparison. You can pontificate about how it gets you nowhere. The truth is, there is no getting rid of it. It starts at birth. The measure of your worth is linked to the potential and prowess of those around you. What was of relevance was my performance in comparison with my classmates. The problem, I came to realize, had to do with the frame of reference. I had lauded myself for walking to campus one day. Why is it a big deal, you may ask? In the months since I started graduate school, my energy levels had dropped to a precipitous low. I closely guarded the minimal reserve to finish essential tasks. Compared to my inactivity, walking, even if only for a few blocks, felt like an achievement. The bar had been brought down to a low, and surpassing it was no longer a challenging feat. Not so the case when you have piled one accomplishment on top of the other. The stack becomes higher with every Olympiad medal won. The hurdle soon becomes too high to cross. Your inadequacy is verified. Why did I want to be on par with my classmates? Because being equal to them meant that I would also be approved of. Approval is addictive. It's worth chasing the recurring high that accompanies praise. We attached our identities to accomplishment. Even a slight reduction in its magnitude was perceived as a fall from grace. I thought back to a recent conversation with a professor at Purdue. When I described my stagnation in graduate school, he pondered the crisis and said, "You are caught in a classic case of expectation mismatch." I did not comprehend his analysis. I looked at him when he continued, "We set you up for disappointment." We have several dangerous notions about expectation. We feel entitled to define our expectations proportional to our efforts. We benchmark our present experience against a previous high without once factoring in a dissimilar environment. Often, what we expect is not based on our thoughts alone. Parents, a spouse, and even a neighbor will dictate what your expectations should be. You begin to feel unhinged only when your expectations are not met. If your lack of progress is crippling you, as was the case for me, what do? You can quit. Yes, it's an option always available to anyone embarking on an endeavor that is not fail-proof. Leaving a program unfinished does not translate to mean you're weak. It only indicates that you dare to start afresh and give importance to your happiness. We write the rules of our lives. Therefore, regardless of what anyone thinks, we should have the freedom to remove ourselves from an environment not conducive to growth. What if I have to continue despite my disabling circumstances, you may ask? You have to understand that there are factors outside your control that prevent you from achieving your goals. It's in your power to rethink your ambitions. By being gentler on yourself, Considering your extraordinary surroundings, you can find contentment in the results derived from your ceaseless striving. When my friends pitched the idea of a road trip to Malibu, I said no. I refuse to let you stay by yourself, a friend quickly retaliated. A short lived determination to unstuck myself from a rut struck me. A change of scene, I thought, some fresh air. I convinced myself that this vacation would yank me out of my misery. I tried to pay attention to the cheerful babble of my friends. My roommate nudged me to sing along with her. The tears were back. There was no turning around. I would have to play act happy for the whole duration of this journey. I was in the company of people who loved me. I had fervently hoped to leave my woes behind temporarily and relax. Now, though, I could not shake off the feeling that I had been singled out and meted a dreadful punishment. Old, happy me clapped her hands in wonder as the waves touched her feet. All I could see now were my friends silhouetted against a black, engulfing vastness. I mindlessly clicked pictures of my roommate enjoying herself in the water, balancing on a rock before jumping down again. I threw a cardigan over myself and slipped out unnoticed to rest in the car. I felt despondent no matter where I went. The solution did not lie in driving out of campus. It's a dicey conversation to have with someone you care about deeply, suggesting that he or she see a mental health professional. When it's unaccompanied by an assuring preamble, the trouble with this statement is that it's misconstrued. Go see a therapist often comes across as I could care less. Therapy is misrepresented as being a universal solution to depression. I hate to break this to you. This isn't true. The problem is with the way therapy is portrayed in movies and literature. You're led to believe that merely speaking to a therapist will make you more emotionally evolved. How is it correct to assume that by talking through my fears with a rank stranger, qualified albeit, I'm going to emerge a victor? When you're coerced to speak, your thoughts don't come out cohesively. Remember that it's this pattern of thinking that's been holding you back. You stutter, you stammer, you deal with being unable to vocalize what you feel. You're fearful about the ramifications of letting it all out. Everything you say is likely in complete disarray. How can you be expected to give this well rehearsed speech to describe your situation? Can I tell you how I faltered when I was seated across from a therapist? How did you get here? She asked. I'm sure she was referring to my current mental state. When you are depressed, you don't catch nuances. My friend drove me, I replied. The conversation went downhill. She would throw a question at me. Words would fly out of my mouth as if some sluice had been opened. I recognized in retrospect that I wasn't answering her questions. Whatever I had kept locked within was coming out in random order. I'll tell you the difficulty with someone asking questions. You have to think before responding. If all you have with you is a poorly organized repository of self deflating thoughts, you will not be able to mine any meaningful answer. Was there any purpose to being in therapy? Certainly not, I said without thinking, surprised that I was able to respond to at least one question satisfactorily. My friend's words of advice came to me. Follow the doctor's instructions. You cannot deal with mental illness by yourself. She was right. My sickness had nothing to do with the strength of mind. Its effects could be lessened or reversed with timely intervention. I'll beat this without any help was useless bravado. I read the prescription to figure out which pill to take. You were strong in senior high. Do you remember that version of you? A part of me was against this medication. You powered past the insults and proved yourself. Why are you not doing the same anymore? The debate about whether to take medicine or not began in full throttle once more. You could feel worse after taking the tablet. The arguments against the pills piled up. To me, they appeared valid. If there's a severe side effect, you will no longer be able to keep the illness a secret. I had come to a stage when I was familiar with my symptoms. At the onset of a pounding headache, I lay down with a cold compress, waiting for the pain to subside. I combated nausea with evening walks and intentional breathing exercises. What if this new medicine caused a symptom I could not manage in secret? Convinced that I would not take the pill if I allowed this internal conflict to grow, I swallowed it hastily with a glass of water. While looking for candies at the checkout counter in the library, I once spotted a basket full of bananas. A fruit will not kill you, I convinced myself as I peeled the banana. I ignored the slight fear that it could make me nauseous. I took a small bite and tried to swallow it. Have you experienced an uptake of breath after a heavy meal? This banana bite might have been the first substantial solid to enter my system in a while, apart from chocolates. Swallowing the fruit was an upheaval. I rejoiced that I did not have the urge to vomit after eating it. It took me more than half an hour to finish the banana. I ate bite by bite, scared that I might throw up if it went in quickly. I promptly put away my papers when I felt a tiny spurt in energy. I walked home, pleased with my newfound pasta substitute. In the following days, I regularly bought a banana and ate it slowly. I might have been put off by the sweet taste initially. Given how eating the fruit uplifted my mood significantly, I stuck to it. One evening, I took a banana home, evaluating whether I could attempt a short run post my swallow the fruit endeavor. Knowing that wearing running shoes or jogging pants could jinx my new initiative, I stepped out wearing a sweatshirt and an old pair of jeans. I had recently found the isolated slow road leading to Sands Beach while scouting for spots to replace Goleta Pier in Santa Barbara. I reached the beginning of the road and looked around to make sure no one was in sight. I tentatively started to jog. My running was not perfect. I did not research techniques to run fast or for long distances. However, I was determined to continue this practice. I persisted because while running, the predatory voice was unable to keep pace. What was helpful was that the image frame I saw changed continuously. I did sometimes weep after completing a short sprint. However, these tears had a purgatory effect. I feel like I was in a confessional, one without a pastor. Running afforded me temporary yet wholesome freedom from depression. I clung to this hard-won panacea and moved away from being perennially tearful. When you search for tips to overcome depression, you come across a suggestion. Get back to doing things you enjoy. What were the activities you enjoyed earlier? I quizzed myself as I graded assignments in the library. The reply came instantly. You enjoyed reading and writing in school. I stepped out to find my beloved Maya Angelou and returned with I know why the caged bird sings and still I rise. I started with and still I rise. A friend had recently introduced me to auto-suggestion. How about forming a positive narrative, enlisting my strengths, using these poems as an inspiration? I turned the page to one of my favorite poems. I was in awe of Maya's writing as a young girl. Her words had served as a call to action. Be strong and determined, each page of poetry encouraged the reader. The poetry collection was definitely the perfect point of reinitiation to a once cherished activity. I read a poem out loud, sentence by sentence. I finished one whole verse and put the book down. Knowing that reading more of the same poem might cause my brain to complain, I picked out another poem at random and read the first verse, employing the same technique. I alternated between reading verses in different poems. It's important to cultivate friendships both in your department and outside the school. My best friend in graduate school was in the Department of Education, and interacting with her grounded me. When I told her my problems, my best friend listened. She listened without any comment. She didn't tell me what I should be doing next. She didn't probe me for additional details. She quietly let me speak out every emotion that was causing me distress. Two ingredients go into making a magic potion that you can administer to your depressed friend: your time and an unbiased ear. You may now ask me if she provided any grand solution to whatever was causing me angst and despair. The answer is no. You're never looking for that perfect, constraint optimized set of directions that will lead you to a healthier mental state. All you're asking for is your voice to be heard. The best gift you can give to a person you love is not wrapped in fancy paper. It's a treasure all of us possess. It's our time. You can provide some of it and witness the tangible good you're doing for your friend. You can sometimes take a few steps further and lend your ear too. How about you go the full mile and be unbiased when you hear your friend's woes? I say unbiased because listening without providing feedback is hard. You want to be comforting. You want to suggest an alternate route. If you offer the light of silence instead of speaking, you can offer what my best friend generously offered me: a safe space in which I could hear the sound of my own voice. Faith, although brittle, was a steadfast companion as I survived hour long crying spells and sleepless nights. The beauty of prayer and faith is that you can customize it to suit your circumstances. There are no stringent rules or regulations. Here's what you say in prayer, or follow this 20-minute spiritual practice daily to find your center. Instead, by process of trial and error, you settle with whatever makes you fulfilled. What has faith got to do with depression? It's a tool I use to stay grounded. Depression is like a tug of war. It feeds you the inaccurate story that you're inept and are incapable of dealing with everyday stresses. Depression drags you towards the deep end of the ocean. Faith was the counterforce that helped me maintain balance while I stood on the shore. Do you sometimes watch TED Talks and read literature to gain perspective on an insurmountable problem? What do you expect from these videos or books? Do you wish to be given a detailed manual on how to overcome the obstacle? Do you want to hear the story of a person who worked his way out of unfortunate circumstances like a messy divorce, unemployment, or the death of a family member? I identify as a hope catcher. Seeing how it has been prescribed as the cure all, I have always wanted to create a reservoir of hope that I can employ in installments, apportioning it carefully to meet every challenge. Let me give you an example. You've been given a difficult assignment. You know that you have the skills required to complete it. Yet, a mental block keeps you from making any progress. At this juncture, if you plod without giving up on yourself and finish the task, you have deposited the first I overcame adversity event upon which you can iteratively build hope. You see a newspaper and find a report of death by suicide. Parents and friends create an in memory of page to honor a loved one whose life was prematurely cut short. What do you feel when faced with such news? Does it stay with you for very long? To me, news of this nature feels deeply personal. The stories of struggle might have been similar, I think. The feeling of aloneness and neglect might have been similar too. I feel dread, unshakable anxiety that the depression lurking around the corner may swing in and pull me down once again. Then I come to think of a matter of great urgency: the need to cogitate and reveal the horrors of depression so that someone suffering right now has a vocabulary with which to relate. One I never had, hence this book. Somewhat naively, I had believed that you could tuck whole episodes of depression in inaccessible recesses of your memory and keep them chained there. It took me a while to recognize that depression, like a persistent spring, could break through your defenses and rise to occupy your whole mind, often without notice. To be revelatory, to write about an episode so it might be helpful, you have to peel through curtains of consciousness, some unbudging, others flimsy. What results from this tedious exercise is a map of a troubled mind. This perhaps is what I have attempted with my writing. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Kritika, for the wonderful presentation.